Hello there, I have an important question for you. How fast is Max Verstappen actually, when his car doesn't have erectile dysfunction? Want to take this corner? Too bad, bucko. Want to have suspension in your car? Earthquake! But outside of the car, how fast is Max Verstappen really? And to understand how fast he really is, I split up his style into 10 different categories. So, let us get back to business.
Let us back in business.
Now, let's start with this man's driving instinct. The feeling that he has both for the car and on the track is pretty incredible. Now, he is in a better position than most drivers on the grid, solely because of the car. Because I'm not sure how great he would do in an Alpine or Kick Sauber. But I'm not saying that the Red Bull car is by any chance any good. It is a big task for a driver, which a lot of rookies kind of suck at, because you can't be testing on Friday and then go, the car is undrivable.
Yeah, it's impossible to drive it.
Because you have to be very specific about how much understeer or oversteer you actually have. Or if you drive for Ferrari, how much water there is.
Is there leakage?
A leakage of what?
I have the seat full of water. Like full of water.
Must be the water. Must be the water.
So Max's feel for the car is pretty good, but that's just one part. The rest comes in driving. I know guys, I bet you didn't see that one coming. Max is never really scared to attack or defend, even if that works against him sometimes. He is very fierce and drives with his elbows out, which sometimes is nice because it's entertaining to say the least, but sometimes it doesn't really work out in his favor. So Max acts very confident on track, and more often than others, takes a racing line, like I do in a racing game, to defend my position. And the answer to that is way too wide. Or in other words, he just goes for gaps that most drivers would tend to avoid. And you know, credit where it's due, sometimes it's pretty entertaining. Like this man will just invent a completely new racing line on the way, but unfortunately, sometimes he just keeps driving where the asphalt ends. So even great drivers have their shortcomings. Oh yeah, by the way, to start power scaling a driver like Max Verstappen, we will be comparing him to some other drivers on the grid just to get a true idea of how goated he really is. And we're only going to compare him to drivers that shared the grid with the same time. So in the same era of cars, similar conditions, because even I am pretty good in comparison to some of the drivers in the 50s. But anyway, Max has always stood out for his precise and confident handling of the car. So let's compare Max to an old teammate. And you're immediately thinking, which one? Well, the best highlighted two opposites. Let's look at Checo. Now, Checo is a very conservative and centered driver. Checo prefers a lot of downforce, which means it's slower to turn, but the grip is a lot better. Whereas Max turns his controller sensitivity all the way up and is very responsive front end. And that sounded way too suggestive for my liking. But what it means is that he can adjust his racing very precisely and very lately. But at the cost of that, he's more likely to lose grip. And a lot of people do. Just try turning controller sensitivity on whichever racing game you play, and you'll probably crash and die in the first turn. And we've already touched on that overconfidence, where he's very sure he's going to make a turn and just doesn't necessarily all the time. But something that Max is good at is being calm under pressure. Now, the mindset of this man has towards winning is pretty incredible. When Max was a bit younger, we saw him lose his temper very often. Mad Max was around, and it was clear that unfiltered rage was a bit of a pitfall. He has some questionable decisions on track and has been known to maybe lash out sometimes fairly. But honestly, it's fine if he's a little rash on track, as long as he's not abandoning his daughter in a gas station like his dad did. Because if it was me, a little kid getting in my way, RKO! That's a WWE move if you need to look it up. But it's arguably the trauma from his dad that turned Max into an absolute driving menace, because losing was never really an option. Back in his Toro Rosso days and early Red Bull days, he would very often retire because of the Renault engine units. But if you're 15th place cruising in a soapbox with a Renault engine and it combusts, it sucks because it isn't the end of the world. But when Red Bull finally switched to Honda engines and looked back in, the stakes were severely increased for the team. Max became third in the championship standings twice before taking his title. And in that time, Max had to change his attitude, because if he was going to keep throwing temper tantrums, now he would be competing with the big boys. And if he kept a temper, he'd probably bottle it sooner or later. And if you, as a driver and a team, are contending for a fancy drinking glass and a ton of money, it's probably going to put a lot of people on edge. But hey, he did it 4 times. And now, speaking of championships, let's talk about this year's title fight. Because if you can even call it a championship, honestly, because oh my god, it was bad. This time around, Max did all he could, but there's no sense of doing everything for your team with a terrible car. But for the 5th title,
Trophy looks the same. You know, I have 4 of those at home, so it's nice.
in reality, Al Mercedes with terrorist attacks on track. So Max seems to know exactly what to do when it comes to clutching a race. Also, when it comes to communicating with his team though. Because watching McLaren's team strategy, it's like watching a newborn giraffe walking on ice. Because it is way too unstable. Now, why did McLaren stay out with the safety car in Qatar? Because it made zero sense. So overall, it is abundantly clear that Max's racing mentality changed around 2020, where we saw Max end up third in the standings again. And he just finally decided to lock in. And his anger turned into passion. And sure, he still got angry time from time, like when his tire decided to explode in Azerbaijan, for example. But overall, he'd gotten better at dealing with setbacks. Also, considering the stakes were pretty high. And nowadays, Max's racing mentality has matured a little more. For example, when he was taken out by Kimi Talabantinelli, he was still mad, but he showed much more composure than he would have a couple years ago.
I got hit like crazy.
It's clear he's just older now. The aggression and ruthlessness is still there, but it's sharpened into more precise driving. And speaking of precise driving, Max is in a different league of his own when it comes to following the best racing line. Remember when I mentioned that Max had a pretty responsive front end of the car? Well, it makes him being able to correct small mistakes with a laser precision. He's fully locked in while driving in a perfect line with extreme consistency. All the while, bro is casually chatting with GP, talking about what to get for dinner after the race. But for real though, GP will casually tell Max to push for a target lap or adjust his time by a few hundredths in Sector 3, and Max will just do it. His circumstances allow it. He is setting near perfect lap time for the entire weekend. Him and the team also have about their car game on lockdown. If Max doesn't like a setup in practice, he can give the proper feedback to adjust it to his liking. He knows what he wants, and he knows what to expect from the team, unlike Lewis Hamilton, who is currently trapped in Ferrari purgatory, driving the big red shitbox that doesn't seem to want to improve his mental well-being, and the relationship with his engineer doesn't help. All of this makes it almost impossible for him to communicate with his team what he wants. The result? A very mad driver, and almost no results to show for it. But what makes Max stand out more than other drivers is his tire management. He is on a different tier when it comes to how hard he pushes the Pirellis without losing control or graining them too much. Something you'll see other drivers frequently do is they'll ruin their tires. Or if you're Ferrari, you won't have any tires by the end of the race.
Not even there. There's not a single intermediate tire in sight.
Most of the time, they'll come in for fresh tires, push too hard, and lose an incredible amount of pace, and soon they'll be driving on plastic. Sometimes even literally. So Verstappen will just crank out consistent lap times on 20-year-old lap tires, sacrificing little to no pace. And if he does, it's on purpose to prolong the stint. His tire strategy is also strategically violent, like when he came in for fresh tires after the safety car came out in Abu Dhabi 2021, practically dooming Lewis Hamilton, who was on older, harder tires. And his strategy calls like this that are so crucial to the outcome of races. Take a driver like Charles Leclerc, who occasionally peaks onto the podium, and it realistically is only one bad strategy call away from taking the fight to Verstappen. But unfortunately for him, bad strategy calls are a very standard procedure at Ferrari, with the Ferraris even struggling to qualify high some races. But if we're talking about qualifying amongst the drivers on the grid, Max is also one of the best qualifiers, only being outperformed by Lando Norris currently. And it's one of the few things making the quality format so entertaining, because Max will come out with guns blazing at the last seconds and steal pole, which he did time and time again last season, taking away pole positions from the McLarens, making their title fight all the more interesting to watch. So there's two versions of Max Verstappen in F1. There's Race Max, who will slowly suffocate in the dust he leaves you behind, and then will create a big gap so he can make a terrible pit stop. And then there's Qualifying Max, who has the setup of the car, which really matters, but more than anything, God, he is fast with it. He spawns in at the end of Q3 while everyone sweated their balls off in the fireproof underwear, and he just takes pole like that. He pushes beyond the limit without bidding it. Well, most of the time. But the way he pushes beyond the limit of the car is pretty incredible. Other drivers would have gone out spinning like a Beyblade if they drove on the edge that Max Verstappen does, which Tsunoda proved time and time again with his big shunt at Imola this season. But this is also where the sensitivity of controller analogy comes back to bite Max. The front end is alive and Max is threading the needle at 290 kilometers an hour, like he's casually changing lanes on a highway. But then you get laps like Monaco 2023, or the could have been lap in Abu Dhabi 2021. Especially in street circuits, the walls are so close, they're practically licking the wall. One mistake, one lockup, and you're part of the scenery. But Max is about precise as a TAS speedrun and performs on these streets where other drivers can't. And obviously, he's not immune to crashing. It happens to every driver. Though what others don't have is the predator mindset. What helps Max is that he has this predator mindset, and I'm not talking about the behavior learned from Christian Horner. I mean that he's always on the hunt for the car in front of him. Well, when there is one. And when he's leading, racing, he's making sure to create a gap larger than the Grand Canyon behind him. Some drivers race like they're playing chess, but Max in tandem with his team always seems 3 moves ahead. Safety car comes out, Limbias calls him in immediately. Traffic on track, well, Max is warned on time and is advised when to move up efficiently. It's like he's mentally wired to hunt for higher positions, which in some case really shines through. Like very early into his career in 2016, where a pit stop in Brazil dropped him all the way down to P16, and he somehow managed to recover all the way back to podium. But something that helps Max get podium even more is rainy conditions. See, if we're talking about that race, particularly the one a minute ago, the main event that happened in it was the rain, a condition that Verstappen absolutely thrives in. And to anyone that says driving in the rain is not that bad, you've probably never driven on a highway while it rains, because everyone likes to slam on the brakes. Now imagine going 270 kilometers per hour with a heavy spray blocking your view while every high-speed turn turns your fear for your life to slip out. It's safe to say that even most F1 drivers don't like rain, but Max Verstappen weaponizes it like he's just reinvented the atomic bomb. When the track gets wet, the playing field tilts aggressively against most drivers because they either lose too much grip or because they switch tires at the wrong time. But Max, well, he's Dutch. He's built for rain. His driving style is already sharp and borderline unhinged in the drive, but in wet conditions where everyone is losing grip and driving way more conservative, Verstappen drives with the same confidence he always has, while being one slip up away from sloppy style hitting the wall, something that I bet Horner does every weekend. Other drivers tend to struggle when conditions change because it's not something you can prepare for much. And yeah, maybe it's because his dad absolutely put this man through an anime training arc in karting. But he does result in the stuff of F1 mythology. Brazil 2016, for example, like we mentioned before, but also in 2024 in Brazil again, where he started 16th, Lance Stroll bottled it in the formation lap, and one very chaotic race later, including rain, a red flag, and a restart, ended with Max finishing ahead of P2 by 20 seconds, which is just straight insanity, but makes so much sense when we look at Max's superpower so far. Because for this race, he had to use pretty much everything. The only thing that went wrong for him that weekend was qualifying, which was completely out of his control because of his fast lap where a car crashed, essentially booting him out in Q2, and you can guess who it was that crashed. But a race like this was so convincing of Max's skill as a driver. That skill, by the way, is not just born from his dad beating a winning mentality into him, but it's also because of his crippling iRacing addiction. You see, when Max isn't busy making the biggest comeback in racing history to today, he likes to spend his time sim racing, or stealing his girlfriend from another driver and kid and life and position in Red Bull. Anyway, but something about Max is that he seems to sim race a lot more than other drivers on the F1 grid, to the point where on a Sunday he will just QI racing and then go to an F1 race like he's just done nothing. But either way, all that sim racing makes up for a lot of practice, and that's not even accounting for all the time he spends in real cars that aren't F1. This man has driven monster trucks, touring cars, motorcycles, sub boxes, and even recently won his debut GT3 race, winning a race in a Ferrari before Lewis Hamilton did, which just shows how adaptable his style is. So all of this racing does translate to a lot of raw pace, and jokes aside, drivers have to adapt to a lot on track, weather or track circumstances like rain, dust, heat, cold, or even low visibility. So penalties are also a thing, and sudden safety car moments completely disrupt their pit stop strategy. So let's not forget regulation changes. Now imagine getting to know a piece of hardware so well, and then everything straight up changes 4 years later. Car dimensions and setup changes, it's like being Pavloved every time you get used to using a certain thing, and then just suddenly change it. But Max keeps up surprisingly well. If this is somehow the first ever video you're watching on F1, let me catch you up to speed. Every now and then, regulations of the car's designs changes in F1. This is done to ensure a fair competition and technical developments. And if technical developments can go on forever, then one team is just going to win the race and stay on top. But by changing the required designs of the cars, teams and drivers are required to stay on top of it. Teams have to keep developing cars, and the drivers need to keep up with it. The last major change was in 2022, and Max figured out what the rear wanted before most drivers finished their setup spreadsheets, and purposing was such a big problem for so many drivers because they were getting back shots by other cars. But thanks to the designers, they managed to be one of the first teams to overcome it, giving Red Bull a significant edge over its competitors. He also knows what to say to his engineers when it comes to feedback. We briefly mentioned this before, how some drivers like Tsunoda weren't able to give proper feedback on the car at all. But Max is practically giving the engineers patch notes notes on how he wants it. And even if it's wrong, he still drive around no problem if the car is more unstable than a toddler on tricycles. Which brings us to the huge problem. Max is simply too good for his own team. Look, for a lot of drivers, we sometimes ask, is it the driver's talent or the car just being stupidly fast? In the case of Max, he's outperforming the living hell out of that Red Bull. The cleanest and most obvious example of this is where we have a few teammates that couldn't match Verstappen. Checo genuinely came very close, but looking at more recent drivers like Tsunoda and Lawson, the performance gap is almost violating. So bad to the point where I think VCarb is genuinely a better car, which makes me really sad to see that Hadjar got demoted. So Max is consistently operating in a different zip code compared to these teammates. And we're not talking about a cheeky 10th hero there. We're talking about pretty crazy margins, especially when you look at the points and see that Tsunoda has only gathered a handful of them compared to Verstappen last season, despite having semi-equal machinery. So when his teammate qualifies 6th, 10th back, that isn't the car being 6/10 slower. That's Max unlocking performance to the rest of the garage that they can't find. And this is the problem where it really kicks in. Max is driving around the flaws. Every F1 car is compromised somewhere. Understeer, rear, stability, everything. Even the best car on the grid this year, the McLaren 39, was struggling in a lot of dirty air. But looking at Max's driving, I'm pretty sure he had quite a few issues with the car, to say the least. But what's crazy is you couldn't tell because he hides it pretty well. It's like he rewrites the inputs around them in real time, and they really develop the car to Max's personal style, which means he's able to deliver nuclear fast laps. And the production pipeline caters more to him to make sure that his teammates weren't matching at all. So upgrades become more incremental, more tailored to Max's hyper-specific driving style, and less about making the cars universally friendly, which means that teammates are now fighting both the car and Max's preferences. It's like making a gourmet meal catered towards one guy's wishes, and then you act surprised that the other guy doesn't like it. Now, thankfully, in theory, no more Helmut Marko means no more demotions for having an optimized car for second driver seats. But it's still too early to say. Horner's gone, Wheatley's gone, everyone's gone, just gone. And on top of this all, there's an age-old what if Max was driving for other competitors. And a lot of fans just say that the 2025 McLaren was a rocket ship, and one of the sole reasons why Lando clutched the championship, because the car is fast. And of course, if Max drove a personalized McLaren 39, he would probably obliterate the field faster than napalm bombing on a Vietnam afternoon. Everyone knows that Max is the better quality driver. But first of all, that doesn't care, because F1 is A, about how fast your car is, and B, how good the driver is. So when we talk about how fast Max Verstappen really is, it's quite subjective, because although Max's pace needs to be there, so does the car's. So how fast is Max Verstappen really? Well, putting in perspective, if he's getting P1 in races in a worse car, chances are he's one of the best in the world. Subscribe, click the video on the screen if you want to watch more, and I hope to see you in the next one.